All right, welcome to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been talking about the founding and the Constitution. And the story, in the last presentation, we talked a little bit about how the 13 colonies became the first modern democratic republic, democracy, if you will, and the role that the Constitution plays in establishing a regime based on rule of law. I thought I'd talk a little bit about a little current event that occurred a couple of days ago to illustrate the challenges confronting a country and just maintaining basic norms. Donald Trump is running for president as a Republican. He is a former president. He's the first former president. Well, not the first, but one of the first. He is the first former president who's won office to actually run again since Teddy Roosevelt, and certainly before that, Grover Cleveland in the 19th century. He visited Arlington National Cemetery to highlight the deaths of 13 U.S. soldiers in the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. His argument for that event was that he was showing his concern for the families of those veterans. And the problem is there is a federal law that basically says you're not supposed to engage in any kind of campaign-related activities at national cemeteries. You're not supposed to kind of publicize the dead and politicize the dead, if you will. And the challenge here again is that sort of thing does happen on both sides of the ideological spectrum. People engage in political activities to reinforce the sacrifice and the patriotism of people who serve and who sacrifice their lives for their countries. But they also can serve as for people who oppose warfare. And so the challenge here was not that he went, for example, to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That's where pretty much presidents go to lay wreaths on Memorial Day and things like that. He went to an area called Area 60, which is where the people who have died in recent wars are interred. And that is clearly and expressly, you're not supposed to engage in any kind of campaigning activity, and you're not supposed to take pictures, and you're not supposed to shoot videos. And the Trump campaign claimed that they had cleared this with Arlington National Cemetery officials. Arlington National Cemetery officials replied that they expressly stated to the campaign that they were not supposed to go to certain areas with cameras or with photographers. And when the Trump campaign tried to go into Area 60, they basically said to the media, you can't go. And then they tried to keep the Trump campaign video people from going as well. And there was an altercation. Now, what does this relate to American politics? Again, part of the problem is whether the families of those fallen veterans invited Trump or not. It is a kind of political activity that, again, what if there were people in that cemetery at the time that were strong supporters of Kamala Harris, that were visiting their fallen loved ones. It innately draws people into really ugly kinds of conflicts. And as a practical matter, we simply should not be attempting to politicize the dead. And so, rule of law only works to the extent that people are prepared to follow the democratic norms. And one of those norms is that we don't, try to pull the dead into our current political squabbles. And that's all I'll say about that, except again to say this is a kind of a reflection over the extent to which we are battling over really, really basic norms of civility. So what are we going to learn today? First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the actual Constitution and the elements of the Constitution. It creates both bold powers and sharp limits on power. The framers of the Constitution really didn't want to create a government that had the potential for tyranny. Four, we're going to talk a little bit about the ratification process, which was very difficult. It was a closely fought process. And then we'll just talk a little bit about what we think about the Constitution. So the Constitution creates important principles that are supposed to empower and authorize political institutions to govern effectively while constraining those institutions and preventing them from abusing power. Okay? So the Constitution is based on interests. Okay, the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise that we discussed in our last presentation reflected the challenges of creating a common governing document for sectionally diverse sets of cultures. And again, I think I mentioned in a previous discussion, you really had two different societies in place, and you could argue that there were three. In the South, you basically had a society whose economy was founded on chattel slavery. Its politics were decidedly authoritarian in nature. In the Northeast, you had a society that was, basically the political elites of that area were merchants and wealthy people, but there were elements of democracy already appearing in those periods. And of course, the New England states already had a long standing that goes well back into the colonial period, in their formation as religious communities, of having sort of New England town hall meetings that were innately democratic, in that not only were citizens voting on who would lead them, they were going into venues where they would deliberate over what was best for the community. So in between, you had sort of a collision zone, but that was kind of mixed. Those mid-Atlantic states like Maryland and Delaware, where slavery nevertheless existed, but where there were also emerging democratic traditions as well. So the framers were intent on creating a government sufficiently strong to promote commerce and to protect private property. Keep in mind, the framers were pretty much universally committed to the idea of capitalism, to the idea of private property and working to make money. Okay, and I'm not making a comment on that being a good or a bad thing. I'm simply saying that was sort of a consensus issue. So that was something that was very important, and they believed that government had to be sufficiently strong in order to do those things. And it's important to keep in mind, in the early days of the Republic, from 1787 to well into the 19th century, the primary investments that the federal government was making was in the form of infrastructure, building canals, building and improving roads, building lighthouses to make sure that ships had clear entryways into harbors. So those were all oriented to the idea of promoting commerce and protecting private property. The framers were also fearful of the threat posed by what they considered to be excessive democracy. They were very fearful of the idea of tyranny of the majority, right? So they didn't want a faction of radicals to be able to use their numbers to basically fundamentally alter the nature of the government in ways that would be punitive towards, again, the wealthy, which are a minority. Okay, so the framers included several what we would call republican checks and balances, including the separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. Likewise, federalism. The constitutional principle of dividing sovereignty between a national and respective state governments was designed to constrain the power of the federal government, particularly as it related to the regulation of slavery. So again, when you look at the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution, you can see that there are very clear differences, and that the differences dramatically strengthened the hand of government, okay? In terms of the judiciary, or in terms of the executive branch, there was none in the Articles of Confederation. There was a President of the United States with a Constitution that had clearly implied powers, okay, that are oftentimes not clearly enumerated. This is the idea of the vesting clause. When you say the executive power, when you say the legislative power is vested in this institution, you are implying everything that has happened before that has occurred with an executive or a legislative branch or a judiciary. In terms of the legislature, the Articles of Confederation had a unicameral legislature with equal representation for each state. The delegates to Congress were appointed by the state governments, so there were no elections for people at the federal level. Again, with the Constitution, you had a bicameral legislature consisting of a Senate and House of Representatives. Each state was represented by 2 senators in the upper chamber, while apportionment meant that certain, the more populous states would get greater representation in the lower House of Representatives. Again, the senators were chosen by state legislatures at the time. That was changed in 1913 with the ratification of the 17th Amendment. Again, the senators had 6-year terms. It's very long. It remains 6 years, whereas members of the House are elected every 2 years. In terms of fiscal and economic powers, the national government was dependent on the states to collect taxes, and the states were free to coin their own money and print paper money. The states were free under the Articles of Confederation to sign commercial agreements with foreign governments. Under the Constitution, Congress was given the power to levy taxes, coin money, and to regulate international and interstate commerce. States are prohibited from coining money or entering into treaties with other nations, although they can encourage foreign businesses to come to their state. In terms of the military, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was dependent on state militias and barred from forming any form of standing army. Under the Constitution, the national government was authorized by Congress to maintain an army and a navy, and that was expanded, of course, to include additional forces over the course of our history. Legal supremacy. Under the Articles of Confederation, the state constitutions and the state laws were the supreme law of the land of each of those states. Whereas under the national constitution, the national laws and the Constitution are supreme. That is owing to something we'll talk about in a minute, Article 6. Constitutional amendments. Under the Articles of Confederation, it required a consensus. All 13 of the original states had to agree to any change to the Constitution under the Articles of Confederation. Under the new Constitution, 3/4 of the states have to agree to any revision to the Constitution. Finally, slavery. The Articles of Confederation make no mention of slavery. Under the Constitution, of course, you have the 3/5 compromise, and you also have the allowance of the state trade of the slave trade for 20 years. So let's talk a little bit about each of these institutions of government in turn. The legislative branch was designed to be the most powerful branch of the federal government. When you look at Article 1, Sections 1 through 7, they create and empower a 2-chambered, otherwise known as a bicameral, Congress. There are significant differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate. The size of the House of Representatives is determined by population, with more densely populated states receiving greater representation. Basically, the rule under the Constitution was that each state would get 1 representative per 30,000 citizens. That was up to 40,000. But that proved to be unworkable, and in the early 20th century, you had what was known as the Apportionment Act of 1925, which froze the number of representatives at 435. So that creates an environment, again, where now with the apportionment process, because the number is set at 435, membership, the number of representatives each state gets is liable to shift, to rise or fall, where previously, as states hit certain population benchmarks, they would simply get more representation. Now, what is the problem with that? Over time, as as our population entered the tens and now hundreds of millions, that would have created basically such a heavily populated House of Representatives that it would have been unworkable. That we would have had to have built a much larger capital. It would have been, right now we would have upwards of 8,000 representatives. So that was simply unmanageable. Now I argue, and I have argued in publicly, that I believe that we are now underrepresented and that the Apportionment Act should be amended to significantly expand the amount of representation. I think we could go upwards of 900 representatives, and that would actually improve representation because rural and urban areas would be more appropriately represented. Again, the Constitution guarantees to each state 2 senators, giving rise to the possibility of tie votes. This is why the Constitution gives to the Vice President the constitutional authority to preside over the Senate and to basically break ties. Okay? Prior to 1913, state legislatures selected each state senator. Ratification of the 17th Amendment provided for the direct statewide election of senators. The terms of House and Senate members are also quite distinct. The entire House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years, which means, practically speaking, that they are constantly campaigning. They have to be very aware of what's happening in their districts, and they have to raise money constantly. The Senate, each senator serves a 6-year term, but only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. Now, what does that mean? In political terms, it means that it is much more difficult for the minority party to seize control of the Senate. Because you can't rely on these wave kind of elections where something that's happening politically fundamentally changes the nature of people's voting support. You have to have sustained support over several election cycles in order to fundamentally change the composition of the Senate. Each House of Congress also has exclusive powers. All revenue bills begin in the House of Representatives. That means anything related to money all appropriations bills begin in the House of Representatives. The Senate also has the very important power of advice and consent on executive branch officials and judges and justices of the judicial branch, as well as having a role in ratifying treaties. The Senate has to pass any proposed treaty between the United States and a foreign government with a 2/3 majority. So you have to get 66 votes in order to ratify a treaty. Each House of Congress also reflects essential interests. Okay, the House of Representatives was designed to be the people's house and was created to articulate the democratic impulses of the nation's citizens. The Senate, in contrast, was designed to be the more deliberative body, representing the interests of the states themselves. Their longer terms and staggered elections was designed to place the Senate somewhat above the passionate impulses of the electorate in any given election cycle. So, the doctrine of expressed powers confines the powers of Congress and the executive to enumerated powers. However, Article 1, Section 8 also contains the necessary and proper clause, which dramatically expands the potential legislative authorities granted to Congress. And that has routinely been invoked. And again, you've got this idea on the one hand, well, if it's not listed, then you can't do it. But on the other hand, you've got this phrase, which is also known as the elastic clause, that does give Congress the authority and has often been used by the judiciary to say, yes, they do have the authority to act in this way. The executive branch created a brand new office, right? The Constitution created an energetic executive designed to overcome what was perceived as a serious defect of the Articles of Confederation. So under the Articles, the national government was frequently paralyzed by deadlocks. The Constitution created the institution of the president to act independently of the people, Congress, or other institutions of government in times of emergency. In other words, presidents were supposed to be able to act decisively at crisis points when something needs to be done to resolve the crisis. The office of the president was designed to take the lead in the formulation and conduct of foreign policy. Among the foreign policy powers extended to the president by the Constitution include the power of the president to receive foreign ambassadors. This is called the power of recognition. Presidents have the power to negotiate treaties with foreign powers, subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. Article 2, Section 2 also designates the president as commander-in-chief of all armed forces. So presidents have, important diplomatic powers. They also have important military authority, and ultimately they have the appointment power, right? All of these are designed to give the president an upper hand in the formulation and conduct of foreign policy. The office of the president was designed to take the lead, and there are also delegated powers that are given to the president. The Constitution clearly envisioned that there would be a cabinet comprised of executive branch agencies and implied a process of delegated powers where Congress would create and empower agencies to aid the president in what is known as the faithful execution of the laws. This is actually a charge given to the president within Article 2, that the president must faithfully execute the laws of the land. This has given rise over time to an extensive, what we call an administrative state, where again you have dramatically increased powers of the president to act in instances where the government is otherwise stalemated and where Congress may be controlled by the other party and not want the president to act in certain ways. This is where a lot of the conflict between Congress and the president has emerged at various points in time. So the president also plays a pivotal role in both the legislative and the judicial processes. The president's role in the legislative process includes the power to sign or to veto legislation. The president also plays a role in issuing the State of the Union, right, which puts Congress in a position to act on those things that the president is pointing to as being significant challenges. Likewise, within the judiciary, the president has the power to nominate judges and Supreme Court justices subject to the advice and consent of Congress. And you can see, in the term of office of Donald Trump, just how consequential that power can be. If you will recall, in the last year of Barack Obama's presidency, Antonin Scalia, a conservative associate justice of the Supreme Court, died suddenly and unexpectedly. Barack Obama, in March of 2016, a full 6 months prior to the presidential election, nominated Merrick Garland, who was then at the time serving as a judge in the D.C. Circuit, which is one of the most important circuit courts of appeals in the country, to replace Scalia. But the Senate, which was controlled by Republicans at the time, refused to hold confirmation hearings on Barack Obama's nomination. Basically the argument of Republicans, led by then Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, basically said, we think the people should determine who the president will be that will replace Antonin Scalia. And so, Donald Trump won, and he was able to replace Scalia with Neil Gorsuch. And then when Anthony Kennedy retired, he was able to replace Anthony Kennedy with Brett Kavanaugh. And then when a liberal justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died literally weeks before the 2020 election, Mitch McConnell, with Republicans still in control of the Senate, forced the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett onto the court in one of the most rapidly executed confirmation hearings in the history of our country. And the result is that Republicans today have a 6-3 supermajority on the Supreme Court. And the result of that has been a number of very controversial Supreme Court rulings, including the one in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Company that basically overturned the precedent of Roe versus Wade and basically returned the control to ban abortions to the states. And now I think 1/3 of the states have fairly strict bans on abortion. So that gives you an idea of how important it is to know who the president is at any particular point in time. It really illustrates the power of the presidency. America side by side. This gives you an example of, this picture shows you which countries are what we would call parliamentary systems, or semi-presidential systems, or presidential systems, or other, which would be, in many instances, communist countries. So when you look at the United States, we are in blue. That means we are a presidential system. The primary distinction between a parliamentary system and a presidential system is that the president is elected separately from the legislative body. In a parliamentary system, the executive effectively emerges from the legislative body. So in England, which is really sort of the origin point for the parliamentary system, elections are held for the House of Commons. And whichever party wins control, the leader of that party then becomes the prime minister. And the prime minister is thereby considered the head of government. And typically in a parliamentary system, you're in a position where the government can work its will. There is very little, there's nothing in the way of checks and balance, or little, I should say, in terms of checks and balances. And in a parliamentary system, there is a division between the head of government, which would be the head, the prime minister, and the head of state. Remember, in England, the king or the queen of England is still considered to be the head of state. In a presidential system, the president is both the head of government and the head of state. Okay? Semi-presidential systems like France and Russia basically employ kind of a hybrid where the president is independent and where Congress, where you also have a prime minister serving. And where certainly in both France and Russia, the president is the more powerful position. And again, Russia has basically slid into becoming an authoritarian government again. In France, they still retain a fairly robust democratic government. The judicial branch was designed to be a check on too much democracy. Okay, and again, remember, the framers viewed democracy as more like mobocracy, as the threat of a government unleashed on the people and controlled by some vengeful faction. Article 3 established an institution to interpret the laws independently of the political branches of government. So once confirmed, federal judges and Supreme Court justices enjoy lifetime tenure, and their salaries cannot be reduced or eliminated while they are serving. However, the judicial branch is not entirely free of political considerations. In particular, the nomination process has proven to be fraught with partisan infighting, as I mentioned with the discussion of the 3 Supreme Court justices. Recent reports of Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito accepting lavish gifts from wealthy donors has also stirred up a great deal of controversy, leading Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts to publish a set of ethics guidelines for the court, which to date is not viewed as subject to the Federal Code of Judicial Ethics that constrains federal district and circuit court judges. And to be clear, right now it appears that the Supreme Court's Code of Ethics is it remains voluntary. It really has no mechanism of enforcement. So there is effectively a non-democratic character to the judicial branches, with justices and Supreme Court justices nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The judiciary ideally acts as an apolitical check on the more radical democratic impulses of either the political branches of government. The framers wanted to create a strong national government that would nevertheless be prevented from interfering with the individual liberty or for the property ownership, which again in the early republic meant protecting slavery as an institution. So that was sort of the purpose of an independent judiciary. Judicial review is an asserted power. Part of the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction involves resolving conflicts between the federal government and state governments. But judicial review is not expressly articulated in Article 3 unless you consider the vesting clause to be implicitly enabling a power of judicial review. However, at this point, most constitutional scholars do not think that's the case, and they believe that judicial review was established for the court with the power, with the decision in Marbury versus Madison, which we'll discuss in a later presentation. National unity and power set the new Constitution apart from the old articles. The framers' commitment to the development of an American state was a major departure from the Articles of Confederation. Article 6's Supremacy Clause declared the federal government, the Constitution and the federal laws to be the supreme law of the land. Based on Article 6, all government officials, federal, state, and local, are obliged to swear an oath to support the Constitution. Article 6, however, also prohibits the imposition of religious tests as a qualification for public office or public trust. So if anyone ever tells you that the United States is a Christian country, you can cite the clause in Article 6 to raise the question of whether that was actually the case. Most historians accept that the Constitution's framers were not expressly attempting to create a Christian nation. They were trying to create a nation that would be religiously agnostic. The Constitution establishes the process for amendment and ratification. So Article 5 of the Constitution establishes a process for amending the Constitution. And the amendment process was designed to be very difficult. Since 1791, when the first 10 amendments were ratified together as the Bill of Rights, the Constitution has only been amended 17 times over a 234-year span. 7 of those amendments were ratified in 2 relatively brief periods: the post-Civil War era from 1865 to 1869, and the Progressive era from 1913 to 1920. There are 2 processes for proposing amendments and 2 for ratifying them. The constitutions facilitate governing by acting as, again, rules governing, rules guiding governance. So if you change the rules continually, it makes it a lot harder to follow the rules, okay? So this slide kind of gives you an illustration of the 2 processes for proposing and the 2 processes for ratifying. So to propose, method A is the passage in the House and the Senate, each by 2/3 vote, of a proposal to amend the Constitution. Method B would be passage, you have to actually propose a state convention, that would, which is the equivalent of what we had with the Constitutional Convention, right? Passage in a national convention called by Congress in response to petitions by 2/3 of the states. So in terms of ratification, you have acceptance by a majority vote in the legislatures of 3/4 of the states. That has been the dominant mode of acceptance. And then the other way would be acceptance by conventions called for the purposes for the purpose of ratifying a convention in 3/4 of the states. That process has only been done once, and that was the ratification of the, what was it? 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. Okay? And the second method of proposing an amendment has never been done, because look what happened last time. We ended up with an entirely different constitution. In terms, again, of the constitutional limits on the national government's power, again, the Congress has the power to pass federal laws. They control federal appropriations. They approve treaties and presidential appointments. They regulate interstate commerce, and they establish the lower court systems. And again, Congress can create courts. They can also eliminate courts at the lower level. For the executive branch, the executive branch is required to enforce the laws. The commander-in-chief, it's the commander-in-chief of all armed forces. They can negotiate foreign treaties. They can propose laws. They can appoint Supreme Court justices and federal judges, and they can issue pardons in federal court. And then finally, the judiciary has the power to decide constitutionality of laws, and they decide cases involving disputes between states. So when you look at this slide, it basically shows you what the separation of powers is designed to do. Okay? But it's important to keep in mind that, as the presidential scholar Richard Neustadt said, the idea of the separation of powers is actually a misnomer. What you actually have are separate institutions sharing power. Okay? And that's the reason for that is this idea of checks and balances, right? So the executive branch has power over the legislature. They can veto acts of Congress. They can call Congress into special session. They carry out the laws, and thereby they interpret the laws. Presidential signing statements basically can change what Congress really intended. And then, of course, the vice president can cast a tie-breaking vote over legislation in the Senate. The legislature also has power over the executive. They can override a presidential veto. They can impeach or remove a president. They can reject presidential appointments and refuse to ratify treaties. The Senate can do these things. They can conduct investigations into the president's actions. And they can refuse to pass laws or to provide funding that presidents request. The legislature also has power over the judiciary. They can change the size of the federal court system and the number of Supreme Court justices. They can propose constitutional amendments. They can reject Supreme Court nominees. The Senate can. They can impeach and remove federal judges. Okay? But likewise, the judiciary has power over the legislature. They can declare laws unconstitutional. The Chief Justice presides over the Senate during hearings to impeach the president. If you saw any of the two impeachments of Donald Trump, you actually had John Roberts sitting at the head of the Senate presiding over those proceedings. The executive has power over the judiciary. They nominate Supreme Court justices. They nominate federal judges. They can pardon those convicted in federal court, and they can refuse to enforce court decisions. But likewise, the judiciary has a check over the executive. They can declare executive actions unconstitutional. They have the power to issue warrants, and the Chief Justice, again, presides over the impeachment of a president or vice president. So the separation of powers cannot be sustained unless the constitutional institutions of the federal government can be compelled to stay in their lane. Keeping the legislature, executive, and judiciary from intruding into the responsibilities of the other institutions is achieved, again, through this system of checks and balances. Constitutional limits on the national government's power, again, the federalism shifts the sovereignty to the national government, but it creates a system of shared sovereignty. We might also call it negotiated sovereignty. in this system of dual sovereignty that creates a vertical check between the federal and state governments. In many instances, state governments refused to enforce aspects of the Affordable Care Act because they believed that they encroached on state power. So what you see with federalism, and we'll spend the next 4 presentations talking about how federalism affects the relationship between the federal, state, and local governments. It creates a kind of invitation to struggle. And over our history, there have been periods where the federal government and the state governments largely aligned with one another, and they governed collaboratively. And those were generally periods of very effective government. We've also had periods where the national government and state governments have very frequently been at loggerheads. And we're seeing that today in a really heightened sense where, whoever is the government, right now, Joe Biden is the government. That means that states that are governed by Republicans are frequently contesting whatever the policies are that affect their states that Joe Biden wants to try and do. You actually had, the idea of a Bill of Rights that was proposed during the Constitutional Convention. It was rejected because many people viewed it was unnecessary because many of the states had bills of rights. Many of the original state governments had them, and so again, over the course of the 19th century, the Supreme Court consistently found that the federal Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. That changed with the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. So again, following the Constitution's ratification, there was a movement through the electoral process to add a federal Bill of Rights. James Madison was one of the leaders in Congress in creating a Bill of Rights, even though he opposed a Bill of Rights as a member of the Constitutional Convention. But he headed the committee that drafted what became the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights. Ratification of the Constitution was a very difficult process. Okay, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists fought bitterly over the wisdom of the new Constitution. Article 7 called for state conventions to determine ratification, again because the people that drafted the Constitution recognized that simply sending the Constitution to the state legislatures would be a recipe for them to lose, because the states were going to lose out in terms of how this worked. So they called for independent state conventions to ratify. The delegate elections for state conventions were bitterly contested. In New York, the campaign process over the Constitution's ratification created what became known as the Federalist Papers, which again, this actually occurred in the midst of the ratification process, where Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, 2 New Yorkers, and James Madison, who was a Virginian, but Virginia ultimately ratified relatively early in the process. James Madison traveled to New York to help them draft the Federalist Papers, which were pamphlets that were printed in New York City newspapers. Again, if you're not aware, New York was as a whole, there was probably a majority of people in New York that were hostile to ratification of the Constitution. And as New York went, so would go those territories, the states north of New York. So in terms of understanding who the Federalists were and who the Anti-Federalists were, the Federalists were property owners, creditors, people that dealt in debt, and merchants. The Anti-Federalists were small farmers, frontiermen, people who had debt, shopkeepers, and some state government officials. What did they believe? The Federalists believed that elites were most fit to govern, and they were fearful of excessive democracy. The Anti-Federalists were small d Democrats. They believed that government should be closer to the people. They feared that the concentration of power in the hands of the elites would ultimately lead to tyranny. What system of government did they favor? The Federalists favored a strong national government. They believed in filtration so that only elites would obtain governmental power. The Anti-Federalists favored retention of power by the state governments and protection of individual rights. Who were the leaders? Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and George Washington were leading Federalists. And on the Anti-Federalist side, Patrick Henry, the guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." George Mason, who ultimately swung over to the Federalist side, Elbridge Gerry, and George Clinton. So the Anti-Federalist case boils down to the concern, again, they wanted small d democracy, and they believed that small d democracy could best be preserved by the states. They were fearful of a tyrannical national government that would be a vehicle for the assumption of aristocratic privileges. And remember, these were folks who had escaped from feudalism, from this idea that having money made you better than everybody else, or having, basically caste privilege. They were also fearful of, again, government power, that the national government would subsume the states, would swallow up the states, and would ultimately turn the states into nothing more than servants of national power. So compromise contributed to the success of the new system, right? James Madison campaigned in the House of Representatives, and ultimately he found himself in a race. The Anti-Federalists in Virginia attempted to draw the district boundaries in such a way that James Madison would find himself facing a very formidable Anti-Federalist opponent, a very young man by the name of James Monroe. And so you actually had two future presidents running for the House of Representatives in this district in Virginia. And they were also, I believe, related to one another distantly. And so they actually would travel to campaign events together. And James Madison sort of swung the, and again, if you know anything about the history, James Madison was a tiny little guy. He was like 5'2". And did not have a very powerful voice. And so he was much better as a person in government than as a campaigner. But the way he was able to kind of swing the election in his favor, and he very narrowly won, was by promising to negotiate he said, if elected, I will, lend my hand to creating a federal Bill of Rights. And that mollified enough voters in the district that actually swung the election in his favor. So the Bill of Rights, which was ratified in 1791, included guarantees of freedom of speech, the right to keep and bear arms, as well as protection from unreasonable search and seizure. The Bill of Rights, again, originally only applied to the federal government. When you think about the ratification process, there were a couple of elections. In Virginia, it was a very closely fought affair. And ultimately, there was an announcement by a guy named George Mason, who actually has a university in the District of Columbia named after him. And Mason had been a Virginia delegate to the Constitutional Convention. And he actually, he didn't sign, he wasn't one of the signatories to the Constitution as it was originally constructed. And he was a very aristocratic fellow. The joke was if George Mason was caught in a rain shower and he didn't have an umbrella to keep his head dry, he would drown because he kept his nose stuck so far in the air. So everybody looked at George Mason delivering this address as a declaration of his opposition to ratification of the Constitution. Instead, he delivered an address from the balcony of his palatial home, basically saying that his primary reason for not signing the Constitution was its lack of a Bill of Rights. And so in basically saying he believed that with a Bill of Rights, the Constitution would be an improvement on the Articles of Confederation. He swung a great deal of support in favor of ratification in Virginia. And the anti-federalists, and if you know, Patrick Henry, again, was the guy that said, give me liberty or give me death. He was a small D Democrat. He was passionately devoted to state government. And he was, at this point, an older guy. In fact, both he and Mason were both in their 60s, considered to be very mature fellows. And Henry publicly accused George Mason of having succumbed to a pecuniary influence. Basically, in those days, that meant he publicly accused George Mason of having accepted a bribe in order to swing his support in favor of ratification. Mason, in return, sent a messenger to Patrick Henry demanding an explanation, which in those days meant you are either going to withdraw your remark or I am going to challenge you to a duel. And seconds were brought forth. Ultimately, the conflict was mediated, and the two sides were able to reconcile. But ultimately, Virginia would ratify the Constitution fairly early. And it's important to keep in mind that as Virginia would go, as the most populous slaveholding state at that time, as Virginia would go, so would go Maryland, and so would go North and South Carolina. Ironically, North Carolina held a convention in the opening days and simply rejected the Constitution out of hand. Now, in Massachusetts, again, Massachusetts was very influenced by the politics of New York, and in New York, Alexander Hamilton persuaded the New York Constitution, because he looked and saw that New York, it was a fairly anti-federalist constitution that was elected. He persuaded the delegates, because he was a member as well, to hold off on election and said, let's wait and see how things shake out, because we don't want to be holding the bag and reject the Constitution early and then find out that that 9 of the other states have ratified. So he delayed, and that's an important kind of concept in in sort of the legal process, if you will. Delay can be an important tactic. And in Massachusetts, the debate basically was fairly rational, okay? And where you actually had people who had served in, who had basically been part of Shays' Rebellion, who were part of that convention. And you actually had one farmer from Western Massachusetts come up and say, look, we don't want to go back to that period when people were taking up arms against the government. I look at this Constitution, and I see that it has the things that we sober-minded people think it needs in order to constrain the power of the government. And so, as that debate was going forth, there was one very influential figure, John Hancock. He was the guy who signed the Constitution and said, "I'm going to sign in such large letters that King George won't need his spectacles." And he basically was holding off, claiming that he was suffering from gout. Okay, and John Adams and several other figures in Massachusetts politics who were Federalists approached Hancock, and basically the rumor was that they said they would not oppose Hancock in his aspiration to run for governor if he were to give a speech supporting ratification. And given again the rumor, his stated reason for not being at the Constitution, that he was suffering from gout, they carried him through the streets in a chair, and he gave a rousing speech supporting ratification. And again, the Constitution was narrowly ratified in Massachusetts. Okay, in Pennsylvania, which was one of the early states to ratify, they basically the opposite happened to what happened in New York. Okay, the Anti-Federalists recognized they were in the minority when they showed up in Philadelphia. So they decided on the tactic of denying the Constitution a quorum. A quorum is a legislative requirement that a certain number of delegates has to be present in order for for the legislative body to be able to act legally. So they had enough votes to deny a quorum, but not enough votes to prevent ratification. So they hid out in different places in Philadelphia. And the pro-ratification forces recognized what they were doing, and they basically hired Philadelphia longshoremen to go throughout Philadelphia and find these people, and they grabbed them out of these boarding houses and tied them to railroad, to poles, and carried them through the streets and forced them to show up. Where again, and again, that was reported in papers throughout the states, and a lot of people thought it was really kind of ugly. So ultimately, you ended up getting 9 states to ratify the Constitution. But that left several states that hadn't. As I mentioned, New York had rejected the Constitution very early. And also Rhode Island refused to even hold a convention. Okay? And so North Carolina, once Virginia ratified and once the 9 states had ultimately ratified, reluctantly held a convention and ratified the Constitution. Rhode Island held out until almost 2 years into George Washington's administration under the new Constitution. And Washington actually threatened the state of Rhode Island with annexation if they didn't act. And so ultimately Rhode Island did so, but under considerable political pressure. So ultimately, all 13 of the former colonies and now the independent states accepted ratification of the Constitution. So question and answer, what do we think? What do we think about the values of liberty, equality, and justice? How can these values be combined to best reflect American values? Well, it really depends on what you mean by American. And we typically have at least 2 different versions of what it means to be an American in conflict with one another at any particular point in time. And those different visions are often embodied in the presidential candidates of the 2 major parties. And so you have one vision of America embodied in the person of Donald Trump. And you have another vision of America embodied in the person of Kamala Harris. Okay? And so Donald Trump wants to do certain things with the federal government that he believes will improve the country, will make things better for Americans. Kamala Harris has made similar kinds of promises. Our job as Americans is to find out what these people want to do and make a decision as citizens and as voters as to which vision of America we want to give the authority to govern to. But we also have to recognize that very nearly half of America will disagree with the vision that's being proposed by the candidate that wins. Regardless of who wins, it's likely to be a 51-49 kind of popular vote turnout, which means there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be disappointed in the outcome of the election. Based on your current understanding of the Constitution, is there an amendment you would propose? I would actually, propose a couple of amendments to the Constitution. I would probably amend the Constitution to get rid of single-member districts for election in the House of Representatives, because I think that might lead to the formation of more than one party, or more than 2 parties. And I think that would actually improve our politics, because right now, 2/3 of the states are dominated by one party, which means, the other party, in Oklahoma, Democrats don't have a realistic chance of winning statewide elections very often. That's not good for democracy in Oklahoma. Because, I'm not saying that either party are evil, when they are in a one-party situation, but they are vulnerable to corruption when they dominate and when they're not worried about the other party. And so I think multiple parties A 3 or even a 4-party system would be better. In order to prevent, the proliferation of parties like you see in Israel and Italy and elsewhere, I would say that you have to earn a certain percentage of the popular vote in each state in order to earn representation. But what I would be proposing would be to say that each state is a single district for purposes of representation. And that on that basis, voters would no longer be voting for individuals, they would be voting for parties and for platforms. That would get personalities out of the politics. It would make it much more difficult for economic interests to manipulate and to control the politics of the state. And I think that would be a good thing. I agree with Joe Biden that we're probably going to need to amend the Constitution in terms of dealing with presidential immunity. I think right now the Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. United States effectively creates an environment where the president is above the law in many instances. And I think that is constitutionally problematical. Have events like the COVID-19 pandemic challenged Americans' notions of liberty, equality, and justice? The answer to that is obviously. Clearly they have. Many Americans were deeply angry that they were banned by local governments from attending church services. But again, the problem was that you were running squarely into issues where, going to an enclosed environment where you engaging in actions like singing, produced ideal environments for the spread of COVID-19. And going back to the Black Plague, if you don't have a vaccine for something like the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, social distancing and isolation is really the only way to keep the disease from spreading. And when you think about what epidemiologists were saying about COVID-19, what made it so virulent, so dangerous, was that it wasn't that virulent, right? It only killed about 2% of the people that it infected. But if it had been allowed to simply run wild and infect 3/4 of the population, we would have had 6 to 8 million people dying of COVID-19. And so again, as a public health matter, there have to be moments where you're prepared to follow the directives of government. But this came at a high cost for a lot of Americans. Kids were affected in their schooling. Businesses failed in some instances, some small businesses. If you owned a gym or a beauty salon or something like that, it very likely could have put you out of business, which I understand how bitter people in those kinds of circumstances were. But I also think that it was important to try and keep the worst outcomes from coming to pass. I already talked about this one. So again, the challenge to understanding, the Constitution is that it's only as good as people's willingness to recognize and to follow the law. Now, part of the problem here is, again, we're a nation of 340 plus million people, and we have now a fairly long history. And we have a set of circumstances where we've created a lot of laws. It's kind of hard to know, all the laws. A lot of Americans haven't taken the time to read the Constitution. So they're not really clear on, what the law is. Donald Trump clearly didn't appear to know that there was a federal law, that prohibited using a grave site for campaigning purposes. And if he had gone there silently and simply laid a wreath and walked out and been with the families of those veterans that had fallen, I think that would have been fine. Instead, he insisted on having pictures taken. He insisted on making comments that laid the blame for, for the tragedy of those 13 people being killed in Afghanistan on the Biden administration and on his opponent in the, in the Democratic elections. That ends up pulling him into conflict with federal law. Now, does anyone think that Donald Trump will be indicted for violating that law? Is that a realistic expectation? No, it's not particularly likely. But again, it creates a basic challenge that we confront in terms of people respecting not only the law as it's actually written, but also the democratic norms that flow from having, from being ruled as a nation of laws. One of the students in this class in our discussion board mentioned the fact that we are seeing a serious decline in civility. There was a time when when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, he was campaigning against a long-serving Arizona senator, a veteran who had been a POW in Vietnam. He was shot down over Vietnam, who had demonstrated extraordinary bravery while as a POW, as an officer. He refused to be released until the people that he was being held with had been released. He showed enormous valor in doing that. When Barack Obama and John McCain debated, they met and they shook hands, and they expressed their mutual respect for one another as fellow senators and as rivals. At a campaign event, when John McCain was confronted by a person, a supporter, who claimed that Barack Obama was some secret closet communist and wasn't even an American, John McCain corrected her. He said, no, Barack Obama is a family man. He's a good man. I disagree with him. That was in 2008. By the time you got to 2016, when Donald Trump was debating Hillary Clinton, they got to the point where they couldn't even shake hands after the first debate. When Donald Trump debated Joe Biden, in 2020, Donald Trump refused to shake hands with Joe Biden. Again, the first debate this past time, neither side was prepared. They came onto the stage separately. They at no point really interacted with one another. That's a real erosion of democratic norms, of our willingness to accept the common humanity and the common citizenship of our fellow Americans. Donald Trump right now is campaigning with posters that show Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris in prison stripes, talking about bringing back military tribunals to prosecute his rivals. This is a breakdown of democratic norms that is fundamental to our governance. We have to accept that the other side has a legitimate point. And so we live in extraordinarily challenging times. How do we kind of begin to get ourselves out of this hyper-partisan polarization where we increasingly view the other side not simply as wrong, but as traitorous? That's a difficult pathway to get back from. And regardless of who wins in November of 2024, they're going to be governing, again, 48 to 49, or at least 46 to 49% of the population that fundamentally disagrees with them. That brings us back to, Civil War times in terms of division. How should we govern? How should we behave towards our defeated enemy? When Abraham Lincoln was still president before his assassination, in the final days of the Civil War, when it was clear that the war that the Union was successfully prosecuting it and that its end was merely months away, many congressional Republicans wanted to behave in an extraordinarily punitive manner towards the Confederacy. They wanted trials, they wanted hangings. Abraham Lincoln said it would be better if we let them up easy. If we didn't behave in an extraordinarily punitive manner. And in those expressions, Abraham Lincoln showed his largeness of character. Oftentimes, the true test of character is how you behave in victory, but also how you behave in defeat. You have to be. This is one of the things that scares me about contemporary sports, that we seem to not respect the effort. Even when you lose, that if you don't win, that is somehow problematical. I understand coaches like Vince Lombardi that said winning isn't everything; it's the only thing. The point of competition is to prevail. But the lessons that you learn even when you lose are equally valid and important. And our sports should reflect that. And if they don't, you're again reinforcing the things that are so problematical today in our politics. So I'm going to close on that note. When we come back, our next presentation will be focused on federalism. And again, federalism is a constitutional principle. It divides the sovereignty and the power of government between a national government and constitutive state governments. We'll start with what I call the top-down look, the look at how federalism is shaped from the federal level. And then the next set of presentations will look at it from the bottom up, from the state and local level. I'll see you next time.